Hi friends, welcome to another episode of Dr.Sreenivas' Medical Concepts. Today we'll be discussing motor system. I'm going to really make it simple and easy. Motor system made easy. I'll be touching on all the important points of motor system. So to understand motor system, we need to know certain basics. How an impulse coming from the corticospinal tract controls all these movements. For that, what are all the components which make motor system? First is the cortex. We all know that the pyramidal cells originate in the fifth layer, the beds cells of the cortex, and then descends in the internal capsule, midbrain, pons, medulla, and crossover and goes to the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord on the opposite side. So this is the corticospinal tract which is primarily responsible for all the movements to take place. But then we have another two important systems coming into play to give precision to the movements. They are the basal ganglia and cerebellum. So the motor system, basically all the movements take place to the corticospinal tract, but the fine precision is done by cerebellum and basal ganglia. For example, if I need to button my shirt, taking the hands coming up to the buttonhole, corticospinal tract is sufficient for me. But to put the button, put correctly into the buttonhole, twist it and do these delicate movements, I need the support of basal ganglia and cerebellum. So motor system primarily consists of the corticospinal tract coming from the frontal lobe, the fifth layer bed cells, coming into the internal capsule, midbrain, pons, medulla, crossing over to the opposite side to the anterior horn cells. To assess this, we have the cerebellum and basal ganglia. Here, you need to understand another important concept, the motor homunculus. All the body parts are represented in the brain. But then, the representation is not according to the quantity. It is according to the quality. For example, I have a leg which is very lengthy, but the representation of leg is very small. My hand is very small, but the representation is more in the cortex. So the representation in the cortex is not according to the quantity, it is according to the quality. I keep using my fingers for all purposes, writing, eating, mixing food. I use face for all kinds of facial expression. So the functional significance is more. So when the functional significance is more, the quality is more, the representation is more in the brain. I hardly use my thorax except for perhaps for breathing. I use leg only for walking. So these movements are less represented in the brain. So the allocation of the brain for these parts is less. So the representation of the body parts in the brain is according to the quality and not according to the quantity. Another important aspect is that if you see the motor homunculus, the leg area is in the medial part of the frontal cortex, and then comes the hand, and then comes the face. So all these come together, they are very close in the internal capsule and then descend and then cross over. So, if there is a lesion in the cortex, the clinical manifestations will be discrete. For example, the medial part of the frontal lobe, if it is involved, only the leg area gets affected. Classic example is the anterior cerebral artery involvement, where it supplies the leg area, that is the medial part of the frontal lobe, only the leg gets affected. So paraplegia means not necessarily spinal cord involvement. Even a brain involvement can cause paraplegia. Example, anterior cerebral artery, where it selectively affects the leg area. So a face and hand can get affected, what we call as faciobrachial monoplegia. That could be an internal capsule, but selectively if it affects hand area or the face area, only the discrete parts get affected. But these fibers come close together in internal capsule. Therefore, a very small lesion can produce a dense hemiplegia. So from the internal capsule, it descends to the midbrain pons medulla. The corticospinal tract goes and innervates the cranial nerves in the brainstem. But a very important point is that it innervates only the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves, not the sensory nerve nuclei or the proprioception or the other parts. It goes only to the motor part of the cranial nerves, because this is purely a motor tract, very important. So it goes to the third nerve, which is motor. It goes to the fourth nerve, which is motor. Fifth nerve has got motor, sensory and proprioceptive. So it goes only to the motor part of the fifth nerve nuclei. Sixth nerve it goes, seventh nerve it goes, it does not go to the eighth nerve. Eighth nerve is purely sensory nerve. It does not go to the ninth nerve. It goes to the 10th, 11th and 12th. So what I would like to emphasize here is that it is purely a motor tract going and innervating the motor part of the cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem. And after that, at the level of the medulla oblongata, it crosses over to the opposite side and goes to the anterior horn cell. From anterior horn cell, what emerges is the peripheral nerve going as neuromuscular junction and then muscle. This is the basic overview. Here, what you need to understand is a very important concept. What is upper motor neuron? What is lower motor neuron? So what is upper motor neuron? Upper motor neuron has got two components: corticobulbar component, corticospinal component. Likewise, lower motor neuron also has got two components: the cranial nerves and the peripheral nerves. So if you see this, the corticospinal tract originating and coming up to the motor part of the cranial nerve nuclei, what we call as corticobulbar fibers, is one component of the upper motor neuron. It goes and then descends up to the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. You call it as corticospinal fibers. So corticobulbar fibers and corticospinal fibers together form an upper motor neuron. So what is lower motor neuron? Anything from the nucleus coming down, the downstream, you call that as lower motor neuron. Again, there are two components. One, what comes from the motor part of the cranial nerve as cranial nerve nuclei as cranial nerve is a lower motor neuron. So cranial nerves are lower motor neurons. What comes from the anterior horn cells as peripheral nerve, they are also lower motor neuron. So upper motor neuron consists of corticobulbar fibers and corticospinal fibers. Lower motor neuron consists of the cranial nerves and peripheral nerves. Very, very important concept. What is upper motor neuron? What is lower motor neuron? So this entire movement is controlled by the corticospinal tract, but then it is supported by the basal ganglia and cerebellum. One important point of cerebellum and corticospinal tract is that if there is a lesion in the corticospinal tract, for example, if my right cortex is involved, the hemiplegia is on the opposite side, left side. It is on the opposite side of the lesion. Why? Because the corticospinal tract crosses at the level of the medulla oblongata and goes to the opposite side and then supplies. So a right cortical lesion will produce a left hemiplegia and a left cortical lesion will produce right hemiplegia. This is for the corticospinal tract. But if the cerebellum is involved, the manifestations are on the same side only. Cerebellum. If the cerebellum is involved, the manifestations are on the same side, not on the opposite side. Why? Because of the double crossing. As I said, all movements have to take place in the corticospinal tract finally. But then cerebellum and basal ganglia control it. So if the cerebellum has to control, it sends fibers from the cerebellum, the dentate nucleus goes to the red nucleus and then crosses over to the opposite side, goes to the thalamus and then the cortex. You call that as dentato-rubro-thalamo-cortical tract. From the cortex, again, finally the movement has to take place through corticospinal tract. So it descends at the level of the medulla oblongata, it crosses over to the opposite side. So because of this double crossing, dentato-rubro-thalamo-cortical tract ascending and then descending is the corticospinal tract crossing at the level of the medulla oblongata coming to the opposite side. Because of this double crossing, cerebellar manifestations are on the same side. But if there is a cortical lesion, the manifestations are on the opposite side. A very important concept. So having understood the basic concept, now let's see how all this corticospinal tract can get affected. What are the commonest etiology? So usually a corticospinal tract lesion produces hemiplegia. Indirectly, what are all the causes of hemiplegia? The most important, common and frequent cause of sudden onset of weakness, that is hemiplegia, is vascular. Always remember that if a person has got sudden onset of any neurological deficit, always remember there are two possibilities. The first most important common possibility is vascular, sudden onset. Suddenly he develops weakness. Always suspect vascular. Second close cause is demyelinative. Why demyelinative also can produce a sudden manifestation? Because we all know the myelin sheath, there are nodes. An impulse jumps from one node of the Ranvier to the other node of Ranvier, what we call it as saltatory conduction. So the impulse goes faster and the spread is also faster. So when there is a demyelination, the spread is lost, the saltatory conduction is lost, and the manifestation will be sudden. So sudden onset of weakness, always suspect vascular. Second is demyelinative. The other causes being trauma, head injury. A person has got head injury, he can also present with sudden onset of weakness. Again, there are two possibilities: extradural hematoma above the dura, subdural hematoma below the dura. Extradural hematoma is more dangerous because it's an arterial bleed, torrential bleed. Blood goes on fast. Torrential bleed. Suddenly he will become weak and it is going to produce disastrous consequences. Whereas subdural bleed underneath the dura is a venous bleed, slowly trickling. So it is not generally as dangerous as extradural hematoma, which is usually because of the rupture of middle meningeal artery. Then you have other causes like bleeding into the tumor, metabolic like hypoglycemia can present with sudden onset of weakness. After seizures, they can have weakness, post-ictal weakness. And then very important is hysterical. Sometimes patients may act as if they are having weakness. So how do you differentiate whether it is a true weakness or person is feigning illness, acting as though he's got weakness? You can easily differentiate between true weakness and pseudo weakness by a sign known as Hoover's sign. Hoover's sign, very interesting and very exciting sign. Just understand this basic. If you understand this, it is easy to understand Hoover's sign. Whenever we try to imagine these are my legs, whenever we try to flex the right lower limb, the left lower limb goes downwards. Or in other words, whenever I try to extend my right lower limb, the left leg goes upwards. This is normal. So imagine a person saying that this right lower limb is weak. He is acting. Suppose he is acting, ask him to extend. He says he cannot extend because he is acting, though it is normal. So immediately the examiner tries to raise the left leg upwards, flex. If this leg, if he is acting, he will not push it down because he is acting. Suppose if it is truly hemiplegic, the moment if he is trying to extend this leg, if the examiner tries to flex this leg will go downwards. So he will be able to see it. This is Hoover's sign. So Hoover's sign is a sign by which you can differentiate whether it is a true weakness or pseudo weakness. True weakness, when one leg is lifted upwards, the other leg should go downwards. If it doesn't happen, that means person is acting. So we have Hoover's sign here. Yeah. Then some important points I need to discuss. One is the corticospinal tract affects groups of muscles, not individual muscle. It affects groups of muscles like it affects the, in upper limb and lower limb, it affects groups of muscles like the wrist extensors, finger extensors, elbow extensors. The supinator is also weak. So what happens if these groups of muscles are weak? When you ask them to extend the finger, extend the hand, since the pronator is weak, since the supinator is weak, they will pronate the hand. So this is known as pronator drift. If you find pronator drift, that means person has got corticospinal tract weakness, because supinators are weak, he is going to pronate the limb. So pronator drift is very important. And if you come to the lower limbs, the flexors are the dorsiflexors, the toe flexors, knee flexors and hip flexors are weak, and therefore patient extends the hip. So when he walks, what happens? He extends the hip here, he cannot flex the knee, and therefore he rotates the hip like this and then walks. This is known as circumduction gait. Because he is not able to flex the knee, to clear the surface he has to walk like this. This is circumduction gait with pronator hand. Right. Now I want to talk about a very important concept, Broadband's law, especially for undergraduates. Sometimes for postgraduates, they will be asking about this law and the facial nerve getting affected by this. The Broadband's law, if you see the corticospinal tract, it supplies all the cranial nerves. But not only it supplies the cranial nerve nuclei on the same side, but it supplies the cranial nerve nuclei on the opposite side also. It supplies on the opposite side also. And therefore, if there is a lesion, right cortical lesions, the cranial nerves do not get affected, because cranial nerves get bilateral innervation. That's why you have seen so many hemiplegic patients, they will have weakness on one side, but cranial nerves don't get affected, except seventh nerve. Why only the seventh nerve gets affected? Why it gets affected is goes by the law known as Broadband's law. All the parts, especially the midline structures and cranial nerves, the 7 cranial nerve, which have got bilateral innervation, usually do not get affected. I am going to give some details of the 7th nerve. The upper part, like all cranial nerves, have got bilateral innervation, and the upper part supplies the upper part of the face. Lower part gets innervation only from the opposite side, and therefore lower part supplies the lower part of the face. And therefore, when there is an upper motor neuron lesion, this fiber gets affected, but is compensated by this. This fiber is affected, this is compensated by this. So if the right upper motor neuron lesion, left side lower half gets affected, lower half supplies the lower part of the face, and therefore the lower half of the face gets affected. So in a right UMN lesion, there will be left hemiplegia, and only the lower half of the face gets affected. Angle of the mouth will deviate to the healthy side. Suppose if it is an LMN lesion, both the upper part and the lower part on the same side gets affected. So LMN lesion, example Bell's palsy, upper part and the lower part gets affected. Easy way to differentiate is to look for the Bell's phenomenon. When you attempt to close the eyelids, you can see the eyeball moving upwards. It's a normal phenomenon. But in persons with Bell's palsy, they cannot close the eyelid. The moment they attempt to close the eyelids, you can see the eyeball moving upwards. So Bell's phenomenon is a normal phenomenon, well seen in persons with Bell's palsy. So why only 7 nerve gets affected in a UMN lesion? Because all cranial nerve nucleus got bilateral innervation except 7. The upper parts have got bilateral innervation, but the lower part gets supplied only from the contralateral cortex, and hence in a UMN lesion, lower half of the opposite side is affected, whereas LMN lesion, both upper part and the lower part on the same side are affected. Okay. Now, having told about all these things, upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron, what are the differences between upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron lesion? In upper motor neuron lesion, as I said, the groups are involved. Whereas the groups are involved. For example, the supinator is weak and therefore there is pronation. The flexor is weak and therefore the extension. The groups are involved. Whereas in a lower motor neuron lesion, individual muscles get affected. For example, if it is a C5 lesion, biceps, infraspinatus, rhomboids, deltoid, supraspinatus. Individual muscles get affected. Whereas if it's a UMN lesion, groups of muscles get affected. Here I need to talk about an important law which is known as Sherrington's law of reciprocal innervation. What is Sherrington's law of reciprocal innervation? When we flex, when agonists are flexed, the antagonists have to relax. You got it? For example, if I want to lift my dumbbells, my biceps will contract, but my triceps should relax. If both are contracting, how can I lift the dumbbells? So when agonist contract, antagonist should relax. This is known as Sherrington's law of reciprocal innervation. When agonists are stimulated, antagonists have to relax. Same thing applies for your knee jerk also, for any jerk for that matter. When the quadriceps contract, then the extension of the knee, the hamstring should relax. Sherrington's law of reciprocal innervation. So when agonist contract, antagonist should relax. Both do not contract together except for few conditions like standing and shivering. These are two physiological exceptions, but generally when agonist contracts, antagonists have to relax. The co-contraction of agonist and antagonist is pathological, what you call as dystonia. Co-contraction of agonist and antagonist, you call that as dystonia. Dystonia also, there's a very interesting type of dystonia which is known as task-specific dystonia. Example, writer's cramp. The same muscles, when I use for eating, I can use it. When I use it for mixing, I can use it. But when it comes to writing, somehow there's a contraction of agonist and antagonist, and I'll not be able to write it. This is known as writer's dystonia, task-specific dystonia. Then the other differences are that in upper motor neuron lesions, there is disuse atrophy, whereas lower motor neuron lesions, there is a marked atrophy, severe wasting, poliomyelitis, motor neuron disease. You see all bones, no muscles. The superficial reflexes in both are absent. The tone is hypertonia in upper motor neuron lesions, what we call it as spasticity. That means it affects the anti-gravity muscles. The tone increases in flexors of the upper muscles, upper limbs, and extensors of the lower limb. That's why they walk like this, circumduction gait. Whereas in rigidity, both upper limbs, both the agonist and antagonist are affected equally. Second thing, it is clasp knife. Initially it is difficult, then it is easy to overcome. Whereas rigidity, it is equal throughout. So what are the fundamental difference between spasticity and rigidity? Spasticity, the tone is increased in anti-gravity muscles, whereas rigidity, both agonist and antagonist are equally involved. It is clasp knife. Initially difficult, then it is easy to overcome. Rigidity, it is equal throughout. The deep tendon reflexes are increased in upper motor neuron lesion, whereas it is absent in lower motor neuron lesion. Suppose if you are not able to elicit the reflexes, deep tendon reflexes, for upper limbs you have to clench your teeth. For lower limbs you have to use Jendra-6 maneuver by pulling the hands together like this. It increases sensitivity of the stretch receptors. The plantar, the most important reflex, Babinski reflex. Suppose if it is a UMN lesion, if you do plantar, licit plantar, obviously the big toe will be going upwards, other toes go for fanning. There will be fasciculations in lower motor neuron lesions and upper motor neuron lesions. Fasciculations are not seen. What is the mechanism of fasciculation in lower motor neuron lesion? Fasciculation is because of Cannon's law of denervation supersensitivity. That means when a nucleus is deprived of its particular chemical, it becomes supersensitive to that chemical. I'll give you an example. God forbid if you fail for the first time, your performance will be better in the second time because you know where you went wrong. So you will do it better. Likewise, when the anterior horn cell is intact, there is no problem. When the anterior horn cell is completely destroyed also, it cannot function. But when the anterior horn cell is partially destroyed, denervated, it becomes super sensitive to its receptor, that is acetylcholine. So acetylcholine need not actually touch the anterior horn cell. Even it is close by, it interacts and then it starts throwing impulses. This is known as Cannon's law of denervation supersensitivity. So fasciculations are seen in LMN lesion. And then another important concept is inverted reflexes. At the level of the lesion there will be LMN signs. Below the lesions there will be UMN signs. So for example, if C5, C6 is cut off, supinator is cut off, at the level anterior horn cell is gone, C5, C6 is cut off, biceps supinator will be absent. But the anterior horn cells are cut off, but C8T1, for C8T1 the anterior horn cells are intact, but the corticospinal tract supplying the C8T1 is cut off. So for them it becomes a UMN type of lesion, and therefore you have finger flexion. So this is known as inverted supinator. When you try to elicit supinator reflex, there is finger flexion. The other pathological reflexes you can elicit is Wartenberg's reflex and Hoffman's reflex, by which you can tell the corticospinal tract is affected. Another interesting phenomenon is mirror movements. Mirror movements is whenever I lift one hand, the opposite hand also goes upwards. Mirror movements. These are particularly seen in craniovertebral junction region, CVJ anomalies, cervical spondylosis. It is postulated that the corticospinal tract, the crossed corticospinal tract, the uncrossed spinal tract, there can be haptic transmission going on between these two, and therefore when I lift one hand, the other leg also goes automatically upwards. These are known as mirror movements. They have particular activities where they have to use movements alternatively. That particular activity becomes difficult. Example, climbing the bladder. When you need to climb the bladder, you have to put one hand, then the other hand, then other hand, then other hand. But the moment they put one hand, the other hand also comes, they cannot climb the ladder, which requires alternative movements of hands because of mirror movements. Associated movements. You may think that hemiplegia is 0 by 5. Yeah, the power is 0 by 5, but there are some peculiarities of corticospinal tract involvement. For example, they may not be able to use their upper limb or the lower limb, but when they yawn, automatically the hand may move upwards. These are certain peculiarities of the corticospinal tract, what you call as associated movement. Then finally, as I said, the Hoover sign for differentiation between the pseudo weakness and the true weakness. So when you try to extend the leg, the other leg will flex. So if it is a pseudo weakness and if you try to flex the leg upwards, the other leg should go downwards. It goes, but if it is a true hemiplegia, it does not go. That is Hoover sign, by which you can differentiate whether it is a pseudo hemiplegia or true hemiplegia. So these are all the overview of the motor system I have given. I have talked about utter basics, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. With another interesting episode, we will meet in the next class. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Bye.